course, here's a great detailed summary of the passage you gave, written in the most simple and clear way, so even someone with no background knowledge can easily understand it. Detailed, simple summary. The Sultan of Delhi, his powers and limits. The Sultan of Delhi was the main ruler or king of a large kingdom in India. In theory, he had all the power. He was the supreme leader, meaning he was the head of the government, made big decisions. He was the chief judge, decided what was fair and just. He was the religious leader for the Muslim people in his kingdom. This made the Sultan very powerful, like a complete king or despot, a ruler who does not share power with others. But in real life, his power had limits. Even though it looked like the Sultan could do anything, in reality, there were things that stopped him from using unlimited power. 1. Religious scholars, ulema. The Sultan had to listen to Muslim religious teachers called ulema. These were educated people who knew Islamic laws and customs. If the Sultan did something against religion, they could criticize him. 2. Fear of rebellion. The people of the kingdom could get angry if the Sultan was too harsh or unfair. There was always a risk that the people might rise up and fight against him. This is called rebellion. Hamaj. 3. Old traditions, unwritten. Even if something was not written in law books, the Sultan still had to follow the customs and traditions of the land. People expected the ruler to respect what had always been done. 4. Noble, powerful people. The Sultan also had to consult the nobles. These were wealthy, powerful men who helped run the kingdom. If the Sultan ignored them, they could turn against him or stop supporting. Some sultans were strong enough to rule alone. Only a few sultans had the strength and courage to rule without listening to others. These sultans had a very powerful army, and so they could ignore the religious teachers, the nobles, and the people. They ruled by their own will, doing whatever they thought was right. Only one famous sultan was able to do this fully. Balban. Most sultans shared power. Most other rulers, like Iltutmish, had to work with others. They could not ignore the nobles. They had to listen and follow advice, and they couldn't rule fully on their own. Summary of the scene. The Sultan of Delhi looked like a king with unlimited power, but in real life he had to listen to others, respect religion and tradition, and fear rebellion. Only a very strong sultan with a big army could rule alone. Balban was one such strong sultan. Others, like it, had to share power with nobles and advisors. Would you like this turned into a mind map, flowchart, or short story format to help you remember better? Absolutely. Here's a great, deepest and most detailed summary of the entire explanation about the ministers of the Delhi Sultanate, written in the simplest, clearest English, with all important points organized and broken down so that even a complete beginner can understand everything. Ministers of the deep, easy to understand summary, like the world's best teacher explaining. What was the Delhi Sultanate? The Delhi Sultanate was a group of Muslim rulers who ruled much of northern India from 1206 to 1526 CE. The head of the government was the Sultan king. The Sultan ruled from Delhi, the capital. To help the Sultan manage everything, he had a central government with several important ministers. The government was poorly organized. The Delhi Sultanate did not have a well-planned system. The government grew randomly over time. This means there was no smart design or structure like we see in modern governments. It was like building a house room by room without a blueprint, messy and uneven. Main point. There were 4 key ministers at the Sultan's court. Each one had a specific job to help run the kingdom. Let's explore them deeply and simply. 1. Wazir, the chief minister, head of all ministers. Job handled money, taxes, supervised other departments, sometimes even led the army. Explained simply, the wazir was the most powerful minister just below the sultan. He managed all money matters, how money was taxes, stored and spent. He watched over the other ministers to make sure they did their jobs right. Even though he was not a soldier, sometimes he had to lead armies. He ran the military salary office, making sure all soldiers were paid. His office team included his assistant, clerks and accountants did paperwork and money records. Mushrifi Mamlik equals chief accountant, kept detailed money records. Musli Mamalik equal auditor, checked for mistakes or fraud. Think of him as the CEO's right hand, like a finance and operations director in a company. 2, Arizi Mamalik, the army minister, took care of soldiers, hiring, training, equipment and payment. Explained simply, he was in charge of the entire military system. He recruited soldiers, found and hired them. He kept the muster roll, a full list of all soldiers' names. He made sure the soldiers had good weapons and armor. He checked if soldiers were strong, skilled, and ready to fight. He also paid all soldiers. He was like a money manager for the army. He regularly inspected troops to check their readiness, made sure no soldier was being lazy or unprepared. Think of him as a military general and HR manager rolled into one. 3, Diwani Insha, the Minister of Records and Royal Letters. Job, wrote and recorded everything the king said or did. Explained simply, this minister wrote royal orders and announcements. He also wrote and sent official letters for the Sultan. He kept a record of everything the Sultan did, like a diary keeper. He had a team of writers and clerks to help him write and record things. He often travelled with the king, like a personal assistant and historian. Think of him as a secretary, letter writer, royal historian.
Diwani Rasalat.
Minister of Foreign Affairs. Job handled relationships with other countries. Explained simply, he was in charge of talking to other kings and countries. He handled letters, messages, and meetings with foreign rulers. He took care of ambassadors from other lands. He made sure the kingdom had peaceful and smart relations with other kingdoms. Think of him as a foreign minister or ambassador coordinator. Complete table summary, minister, role title, main job descriptions, inspected army, chief minister, handled money, taxes, other ministers, even led army if needed. Ariz-e Mamalik, army minister, recruited, trained, paid soldiers, inspected Ani Insha, records letter minister, wrote royal orders, sent letters, kept records of king's actions.
Diwani Rasalat.
Foreign Affairs Minister, managed messages with other kings, handled ambassadors and diplomacy. Why this was important? Even though the government was not well planned, these ministers helped the Sultan control the huge empire. Each minister had a clear duty so that one person didn't have to do everything. These roles were like departments in a company, each one managing a part of the business. Final takeaway. In super simple words, the Delhi Sultanate was a powerful kingdom. Its government was messy, but the 4 main ministers helped run it. One took care of money and taxes. One looked after the soldiers and army. One wrote all the official records and letters. And one dealt with foreign countries. Each one played a key part to help the Sultan rule better. Would you like me to make a chart, a story, or a memory trick to help you remember these 4 ministers forever? I can do that too. Just say the word. I'm sure. Here's a great detailed summary of the passage in the simplest, clearest, and easiest to understand language, like you're learning for the first time. Detailed summary. 2 very important officers after ministers. In the Delhi Sultanate, besides the main 4 ministers, there were 2 more powerful officers who were almost as important. Their role was crucial in keeping the kingdom running smoothly. Let's learn about them one by one. One, Baradima Malik, the chief of intelligence and news reporting. This officer was like the head of Secret Service and news. His job was to collect information from all over the empire. He had many people working under him, like news writers who sent daily reports about events in cities and villages, spies who worked secretly to find out if anyone was planning to cheat, betray, or revolt against the Sultan. Why was he important? He helped the Sultan stay informed. He helped stop rebellions before they could start. He made sure no minister or officer was misusing power. Example, like a combination of a modern-day CIA chief plus news agency head. He knew everything going on in the kingdom. 2. Qazi Mamalik, the Chief Justice of the Empire. This officer was the top judge in the Sultanate. He was the head of all courts and had the final say in any matter. If two people had a fight over property, or if someone committed a crime, his court gave the final decision. He also had another job. He was also in charge of religious matters. He looked after Islamic religious affairs. In this role, he was called Sadar-i-Jahan, or Sadar-us-Sudur. Both mean head of religious department. Why was he important? He made sure laws were followed. He made sure Islamic rules were respected. He gave justice and kept the people's faith in the Sultan's rule. Example, like the Chief Justice of India, head of religious affairs in one person. In short, officer name, role, importance.
Baradima Malik.
Chief of news and spying, informed Sultan, stopped problems early, watched everyone, chief judge plus head of religious affairs, gave justice, ran courts, and managed religion. Final summary in one line. These two officers, one for secrets and spying, the other for justice and religion, were almost as powerful as ministers and helped the Sultan keep control and peace in the empire. Would you like a visual comic strip, a story version, or a quiz to help remember this better? Absolutely. Here's a great, deep and very detailed summary of the passage you gave, written in the simplest and clearest way, as if teaching a total beginner or a young student with no baggage. Let's make this flawless and complete so you understand everything clearly and deep detailed passage. This passage talks about important people, officials, palace of a sultan, Muslim king during medieval times. These people were not ministers, so they didn't make big government decisions like a minister, but they had very important jobs that helped the king in his daily life and palace management. Let's understand each part clearly and deeply. 1. High officials in the capital. The capital is the main city where the sultan lives. Inside the capital, especially in the palace, there were officers. These officers worked closely with the royal household, meaning they managed the king's personal needs, palace affairs, and helped organize events. Important note, their rank was lower than ministers, which means they didn't have power over big political decisions, but that they still had important and powerful roles inside the palace.
2.
Vakili Dar, the royal household manager, most important among these officials. Vakili Dar means the deputy of the house. He was like a comptroller or main manager of the royal household. His job was to supervise everything happening in the palace, make sure the palace ran smoothly, like food, servants, guards, money, guests, and more. Stay close to the king because the job required personal trust. Because he was always near the king, he had a lot of influence, hidden power. Example, like a hotel manager who lives in the same hotel as the owner and talks to the owner every day. So he becomes important even if not officially a big boss. 3.
Amir Jab.
The master of ceremonies. This officer's main job was to manage how things happen in court, the king's official room. He made sure that everyone followed the rules of the court, like how to behave, speak, dress. Events were organized in a respectful way. He also acted as a bridge or middleman between the Sultan, king, and the lower officers and common people. People could not directly walk up to the king. They had to go through Amir Hajib to get permission for a meeting. Example, like a VIP secretary who controls who gets to meet the Prime Minister and how they behave in the meeting.
4. Sorry, Jandar.
The head of the royal bodyguards, Jandar, means bodyguard. This officer was the chief commander of all royal bodyguards. He was responsible for protecting the king day and night, ensuring the guards were well trained, alert and loyal, making sure the palace and the king were always safe from attack or harm. Example, like the chief of the king's personal security team, today's equivalent is the chief of the president's security, like the Secret Service.
5. Amiri Akur.
The master of horses. Akur means stable, place where horses are kept. This officer took care of all the horses of the king and army, the stables, horse health, feeding, training, ensured horses were ready for war, travel or royal events. Horses were very important in war and travel, so this was a highly trusted job. Example, like the head of the royal garage, but instead of cars, he managed horses. 6. Shane Pilan, the superintendent of elephants. Shana means officer superintendent and Pilan means elephant. This officer was in charge of all royal elephants, taking care of them, feeding, training and housing them, preparing elephants for war, parades and royal shows. Elephants were like tanks in olden times, used in battles and as a sign of royal power. Example, like someone who manages giant royal machines, but living animals, elephants.
Final summary.
In one simple paragraph, in the king's capital city, there were several important officers who worked in the palace. The most important of them was the Vakili Dar, who managed the royal household and stayed close to the king. The Amir Hajib made sure people followed court rules and helped arrange who got to meet the king. The Sari Jandar protected the king as the head of bodyguards. The Amir Akur looked after all the king's horses. The Shani Pilan took care of elephants used in wars and royal events. These were not ministers, but they had very important jobs in running the palace and helping the king. Would you like a comic strip, chart or quiz questions to help remember all these easily? Absolutely. Here's a great, deep and very detailed summary of the passage, explained in the simplest and easiest words, background in history or complex terms. Detailed summary in simplest words. 1. A special deputy ruler was created sometimes. In some time periods, a new powerful post was created by a few sultans. This post was called Naibi Mamlakat. It means deputy of the kingdom. The person in this post was like a helper king or second in command. He had more power than even the prime minister wazir, but only when the sultan allowed it. Even 2, this deputy had power only when the sultan wanted. This powerful position did not always exist. It was used only sometimes, for example, during Sultan Balban's rule. Even then, the Naib did not have real power on his own. He could only do the things the Sultan told him to do. So the Naib was not like a king, just an assistant with limited powers. 3. Ministers were servants of the Sultan. The Sultan personally picked the ministers who helped run the government. These ministers were his personal workers, not independent leaders. They had to follow the Sultan's orders, not do things on their own. 4. Ministers reported only to the Sultan. Ministers were answerable only to the Sultan. They didn't report to other officers or the public. They could not act like rulers themselves. 5. Ministers became powerful only if the king was weak. Ministers were not the bosses of their departments. They had no real control unless the Sultan was a child, a minor, or the Sultan was weak and controlled by his nobles, like a puppet. 6. Strong kings like Balban did not let ministers make decisions. Sultan Balban was a very powerful and strict ruler. His ministers had no freedom to make decisions. He told them exactly what to do, even for small daily matters. They were there to carry out his orders, not to give advice or suggest ideas. Final easy summary. A temporary assistant king, Naibi Mamalikat, was used by some sultans, but only had power if allowed. All ministers were chosen by the sultan and worked only for him. Had no real power unless the sultan was weak or a child. Under strong rulers like Balban, they could only follow orders, even for small things. Would you like me to now make this into a fun comic strip with characters to show it visually? Sure, here is a great, deepest and most detailed summary of the topic. The provincial government under the slave rulers, written in the simplest and easiest words, as if teaching someone with no background knowledge at all. Detailed summary. The provincial government under the slave rulers, Delhi Sultanate. 1. What was the slave dynasty? The slave dynasty ruled Delhi from 1206 to 1290. Some of these rulers were once slaves or servants of earlier kings, but they became very powerful and ruled large parts of India. Example, Din Aibak was a slave of Muhammad Ghori. Later, he became king himself. Even though they were called slave rulers, they ruled like full kings. 2. How was their government? Their government was not well planned or neatly organized. It was decentralized, which means the king did not control everything directly. Instead, the kingdom was divided into parts, and each part was given to a military officer to rule. So, power was shared between the king and many local rulers. 3. What were these parts called? These parts were called iktas. An ikta was a piece of land given to a military officer by the king. The officer was allowed to rule that land and collect taxes from it. In European history, a similar system was called a fief, so European writers called ikta a fief. 4. Who were the rulers of the iktas? The officers who ruled the iktas were called muktis. A mukti was usually a soldier or army commander, not a civil officer. He acted like a mini-king or governor of his ikta area. 5. What could a mukti do? The mukti had a lot of power in his region. He could rule the land however he wanted, as long as he respected local customs. Hire his own officers, soldiers and helpers. Collect taxes from the people living in his ikta. Spend the tax money on administration, like paying salaries, building things, or maintaining the army. Send the leftover money, called surplus, to the central government in Delhi. He was mostly free to run things, but he had to follow traditional local rules and stay loyal to the Sultan. 6. What was the problem with this system? There was no uniformity, meaning the ikutas were not equal. Some iktas were very big, some were very small. Some had lots of people, some had very few. Some made a lot of money, others were poor. Each mukti had different amounts of power. Some muktis had big armies, others didn't. Some were more powerful than the king liked. Also, these ikutas were created randomly over time, not in a well-organized way. This made the system uneven and sometimes confusing. Part-7. Why did the king use this system? The king couldn't rule the whole kingdom alone, especially during those days when communication was slow. By giving land to military officers, the king rewarded them for loyalty and service, got help in managing faraway areas, maintained control over a large territory without needing a huge central administration. But over time, some muktis became too powerful and started acting like independent kings. This became a problem for later rulers. Final simple summary. The slave rulers divided their kingdom into many small regions called iktas. These iktas were given to military officers called muktis. The muktis acted like mini-governors. They ruled, collected taxes, and paid a portion of the money to the king. Every ikta was different in size, wealth, population, and military power. The system helped the king manage a large empire, but it also made the empire uneven, unorganized, and hard to control in the long run. Easy example to remember. Imagine the kingdom is a huge farm. The king is the owner. but he can't farm the whole land by himself. So he gives pieces of the farm called ikutas to trusted workers, muktis. These workers grow crops, collect taxes, feed themselves and their workers, run the area, and send extra food surplus back to the king. But each worker has a different kind of land. One is dry, one is fertile, one is big, one is small. So things are unequal. If you'd like, I can also create a chart or table to help you compare key points. A simple comic strip or drawing style explanation, a Q&A practice test based on this to help you remember. Would you like any of those? Here is the greatest and deepest detailed summary of the entire passage you shared, written in very simple English, so even a complete beginner can fully understand it. I've added extra background and explanations where needed to make everything crystal clear. Detailed summary. The role of the mukti in the Delhi Sultanate. A mukti was a powerful government official during the time of the Delhi Sultanate, a Muslim kingdom that ruled large parts of India from 1206 to 1526. He was chosen by the Sultan, the king, to rule over a province, a large region or district of land called an ikta. Think of the mukti like a mini-king working under the real king. What was his job? 1. Maintain law and order. He had to keep his province peaceful. That means stop fights or rebellions, punish criminals, make sure people followed the law. 2. Follow the Sultan's orders. Whatever the Sultan asked him to do, he had to obey, collecting taxes, sending soldiers, building forts or roads. 3. Send troops when needed. If the Sultan wanted to fight in a war, the mukti had to send part of his army to help. His power and wealth. The mukti got a high salary. This money came from the taxes collected in his province. He also had his own army for safety in war, a large number of officials and workers to help him manage the province. He was very rich and powerful, almost like a king. Tax collection and vassals. Some small Hindu rulers still ruled parts of land inside the mukti's province. These rulers had been defeated by the Sultan, so they were no longer independent kings. They were now vassals. Vassal equals a local ruler who accepts the power of a bigger ruler, the Sultan, but still controls his own small land. The mukti had to collect taxes from these Hindu vassals too. 1. Kharaj, tax on land and crops. Jizya, special tax for being non-Muslim. How free was the mukti? On paper, in theory, he was supposed to be controlled by the Sultan. There was a central audit system to check if he was doing his job properly. In real life, in practice, most muktis were almost independent. Since they had their own armies and wealth, they often behaved like kings in their region. So they were rulers inside the empire, loyal to the Sultan, but with a lot of freedom. Some of the major iktas ruled by muktis included northern India, Mandawar, Amroha, Sambal, Badaun, Baran, now called Bulandshahr, Koil, now Aligarh, Awadh, Karamanakpur. Central and western India, Bayana, Gwalior, Nagar, Hansi. Now in Pakistan, Multan, Uch, Lahore. Punjab region, Samana, Sunam, Kurum, Batinda, Sarhind. These were rich and strategic areas, and controlling them meant a lot of power. Relationship with local Hindu rulers. These Hindu chiefs had once been free rulers, but were defeated by the Muslim sultans. After their defeat, they were allowed to keep their land, but only if they accepted the Sultan as their superior. This is called acknowledging his suzerainty, paid taxes, kharaj and jizya, didn't disobey or rebel. In day-to-day life, they still ran their small kingdoms, but they had to follow the rules of the Sultanate and give money when asked. Final big picture, TR. The Sultan of Delhi was the head of the whole empire. He divided his empire into provinces and put muktis in charge. The mukti had the duty to protect, govern and collect taxes. He was powerful with his own army, money and staff. He also collected taxes from local Hindu vassal kings who had been defeated but were still allowed to rule small areas under the Sultan's control. Although officially under the Sultan, muktis were often almost independent in real life. If you'd like, I can also turn this a comic strip, make a mind map or visual summary, create a quiz to help you remember, explain this in a story or roleplay form. Let me know. Sure. Here is a great, deep and very detailed summary of the topic of Kalisa districts in the simplest and clearest language possible. I've broken it into easy parts so you can understand everything like a story. Summary of districts in the simplest, clearest words. Is land revenue? In old kingdoms, the main source of money for the king was land revenue. This means tax collected from farmers who used land to grow crops. Farmers had to give a part of their produce, like wheat, rice, etc., or money as tax to the rulers. Two main types of land during the Delhi Sultanate period, especially from the 13th to 14th centuries. The land was usually divided into two types. A. Iktas. These were land nobles, soldiers, or officials. The person who got the land was called a mukti. The mukti collected tax from the farmers in that land. The mukti used part of the tax to pay for soldiers and gave some to the king. Example, the king gives you a village. You collect tax from the farmers and take care of the area. In return, you help the king in war or administration. This land is your ikta. B. Kalisa. These were lands not given to any mukti or noble. These lands were kept directly under the control of the king. The revenue taxes from these lands went directly to the king's treasury. These areas were managed by the central government using special officials. Farmers still paid tax, but they paid it through the village headman, not to any mukti. Example, the king keeps a village for himself. The farmers give tax to the village head, who gives it straight to the king's office. No noble is involved. 3. Why was Kalisa important? The king needed money to pay for his army, build things like roads, palaces and mosques, run his court and administration, keep some power in his own hands and not give too much land to others. So he kept some land as Kalisa so he could get money directly without depending on nobles. 4. Who collected revenue in Kalisa? Village headmen first collected tax from farmers in the villages. They gave the tax to the officials from the Central Revenue Department, King's Tax Office. These officials were trusted people who worked for the king. So in Kalisa land, no mukti or noble had control. 5. What did European writers call Kalisa? European writers called Kalisa lands crown lands because they belonged to the king, the crown. But a better word might be reserve areas because the king reserved them for himself. 6. What about districts and parganas? In early times, like during the slave dynasty 1206 to 1290, land was not clearly divided into parts like districts and parganas. It was not well organized. People just knew which village or region they belonged to. But later, especially by the 14th century, the Delhi Sultanate started using districts, large areas, parganas, small groups of villages within districts. This made it easier to manage land, collect taxes, and keep records. Final recap table. Topic, simple meaning, iktas, land given to nobles, officers, muktis, to manage and collect tax from pampa. Land kept directly by the king, tax collected by government officials, officer who managed an ikaya, village headmen, local leaders who collected tax from farmers, Central Revenue Office, King's Department that collected taxes from Kalisa land, Crown Lands Reserve, names used for Kalisa lands, districts and parganas, clear divisions of land used more in 14th century for better control. Easy real-life comparison. Think of a school with 100 classrooms. The principal gives 80 classrooms to teachers to manage. These are like, but the principal keeps 20 classrooms under his own control. These are like Kalisa. The money collected from the 20 classrooms goes directly to the school office, not through any teacher. That's how Kalisa lands worked. If you want, I can also make a chart, a map, or a diagram to help visualize this. Let me know. I'm happy to keep going and make this as clear. Here is a great, deep and detailed summary of the passage about the army under the Delhi Sultanate, written in the most simple and easy language, like teaching a complete beginner. Deep and detailed summary. The army under the Delhi Sultanate, explained step by step, clearly and simply. Why was the army so important? The Sultan King ruled over a large empire. His rule was only safe if he had a strong, loyal and trained army. Without a strong army, he could be attacked by enemies, be overthrown by rebels, lose control over distant provinces. So the army was the backbone of the Sultan's power. 2. Did the Sultan have a full-time permanent army? Surprisingly, no. There was no big permanent standing army at the capital city. He had a small group of personal bodyguards just to protect him directly. These bodyguards were under an officer called Sari Janda, meaning head of bodyguards. But for big wars, the Sultan relied on provincial governors to send soldiers. 3. Who sent soldiers to the Sultan? The Sultan gave parts of the empire to provincial governors called muktis. The muktis collected revenue taxes from their assigned land. In return, they promised to send soldiers to the Sultan whenever he needed. So, the Sultan did not directly maintain a large army himself. He borrowed soldiers from the muktis during battles. 4. Why was there no standing army in the beginning? When the Turks first came to India, they were invaders, and all of them were fighters or warriors. Everyone in the group could fight. There was no need to form a separate army because everyone already knew how to fight. Example, imagine a group of 100 people. Here is a great, deep and detailed summary of the passage about the army under the Delhi Sultanate, written in the most simple and easy language, like teaching a complete beginner. Deep and detailed summary. The army under the Delhi Sultanate, explained step by step, clearly and simply. Why was the army so important? The Sultan King ruled over a large empire. His rule was only safe if he had a strong, loyal and trained army. Without a strong army, he could be attacked by enemies, be overthrown by rebels, lose control over distant provinces. So the army was the backbone of the Sultan's power. 2. Did the Sultan have a full-time permanent army? Surprisingly, no. There was no big permanent standing army at the capital city. He had a small group of personal bodyguards just to protect him directly. These bodyguards were under an officer called Sari Janda, meaning head of bodyguards. But for big wars, the Sultan relied on provincial governors to send soldiers. 3. Who sent soldiers to the Sultan? The Sultan gave parts of the empire to provincial governors called muktis. The muktis collected revenue taxes from their assigned land. In return, they promised to send soldiers to the Sultan whenever he needed. So, the Sultan did not directly maintain a large army himself. He borrowed soldiers from the muktis during battles. 4. Why was there no standing army in the beginning? When the Turks first came to India, they were invaders, and all of them were fighters or warriors. Everyone in the group could fight. There was no need to form a separate army because everyone already knew how to fight. Example, imagine a group of 100 people. Here is a great, deep and detailed summary of the passage about the army under the Delhi Sultanate, written in the most simple and easy language, like teaching a complete beginner. Deep and detailed summary. The army under the Delhi Sultanate, explained step by step, clearly and simply. Why was the army so important? The Sultan King ruled over a large empire. His rule was only safe if he had a strong, loyal and trained army. Without a strong army, he could be attacked by enemies, be overthrown by rebels, lose control over distant provinces. So the army was the backbone of the Sultan's power. 2. Did the Sultan have a full-time permanent army? Surprisingly, no. There was no big permanent standing army at the capital city. He had a small group of personal bodyguards just to protect him directly. These bodyguards were under an officer called Sari Janda, meaning head of bodyguards. But for big wars, the Sultan relied on provincial governors to send soldiers. 3. Who sent soldiers to the Sultan? The Sultan gave parts of the empire to provincial governors called muktis. The muktis collected revenue taxes from their assigned land. In return, they promised to send soldiers to the Sultan whenever he needed. So, the Sultan did not directly maintain a large army himself. He borrowed soldiers from the muktis during battles. 4. Why was there no standing army? Of course, here's a great detailed and very simple summary of the entire pack. It's written in the clearest possible language, as if explaining to someone completely new to the topic. Detailed. 1. How the Sultan's army began. In the beginning, the King Sultan only had personal bodyguards to protect him. As the kingdom grew bigger, more guards were added. Eventually, these guards became the starting point nucleus of a much larger army. 2. Who managed the army? The army was not a permanent force. Soldiers were called only when needed. A special officer called Ar was in charge of the army. His duties were hiring new soldiers, recruitment, checking their ability, efficiency, giving them salaries, payment. 3. Two main parts of the army. The army was made up of 1. Cavalry, soldiers who fought while riding horses. 2. Infantry, soldiers who fought on foot. 4. Many soldiers were trained slaves. Some of the best and most trusted soldiers were once slaves. These slaves were trained by earlier kings to become skilled soldiers and leaders. They were known by the name of the king who trained them. Muizi slaves, trained by Muizuddin Muhammad of Ghor. Kutubi slaves, trained by Kutubuddin Aybak. Shamsi slaves, trained by Shamsuddin Iltutmish. These slaves were usually cavalrymen and were highly respected. 5. No modern style training. In those days, there was no scientific or planned training like modern armies. Soldiers did not follow drills or strict army rules. There were no organized regiments or scheduled exercises. 6. Army success depended on leaders. Because there was no formal training, the army's performance depended on the army minister, Diwan-i-Ariz, the Sultan. If these two leaders were strong, the army worked well. Governors had their own armies. Provincial governors, local rulers under the king, also kept their own troops. They had full freedom to hire soldiers, train them in their own way, decide how much to pay them, but they were still expected to send a fixed number of soldiers, a quota, to the king when needed. Because of this, their armies were somewhat controlled by the Arizi Mamalik. Final key points recap. Topic, summary. Origin of army. Bodyguards of the king slowly turned into a large army.
Arizi Mamalik.
Army minister who handled hiring, training and payments. Army types. Cavalry, horse riders and infantry, foot soldiers. Slave soldiers, trusted, trained slaves became top warriors and officers. No drills, army lacked regular training and discipline. Importance of leaders. Army worked well only with a smart minister and sultan. Local armies. Governors had their own soldiers, partly under central control. If you'd like this turned into flashcards, a timeline or a mind map, I can do. Let me know what helps you best. Sure, here's a great, deepest and most detailed summary of your passage, written in the simplest, clearest way, with everything explained step by step so anyone, even without any history, can understand it fully. Detailed summary of the specialdom of the Delhi Sultanate. 1. Two special types of soldiers in the Delhi Sultanate. The army of the Delhi Sultanate did not just have regular soldiers. There were also two special kinds of recruits, people who joined the army only in certain situations or for special reasons. A. Jihad soldiers, holy war fighters. These soldiers were only Muslims. They were not regular army men. They joined only for jihad. Jihad means holy war. In this context, it was war against non-Muslim Indian kings. These troops were formed only when there was a religious war declared. After the war, they were rewarded the wealth taken defeated enemy, like money, gold, goods. The Islamic law Shariat decided how the plunder was shared. 4/5 of it went to the soldiers. 1/5 of it went to the Sultan. Example, if the army captured 100 camels full of treasure, the soldiers got 80 and the Sultan got 20. Volunteer soldiers. These were individuals who joined the army on their own without being invited. They were not paid to join, they chose to fight. They brought their own weapons and horses, meaning they didn't need the state to give them equipment. They joined out of personal choice, possibly for glory, religion, or adventure. Example, like a person from a village saying, I want to help the Sultan fight, and then showing up to join with his own sword and horse. 2. Who controlled the army? The Sultan. He was the supreme commander, the topmost leader of the entire military. All soldiers and officers ultimately served under his authority. The Mukti, provincial commander. The empire was divided into provinces like modern states. Each province was ruled by a Mukti governor. Mukti was the head of the army in that province. He commanded local troops in his area. Think of it like a school principal, sultan, and class teachers, Muktis. Each teacher manages one class, but they all report to the principal. Diwani Ariz, also called Arizi Mamalik. This was the army minister. His job was to manage the army, but not to lead it in war. Responsibilities: recruiting new soldiers, ensuring soldiers were skilled, handling salaries, land or cash payments. He did not fight in battles or command troops. Special case, Razia Sultan's general. Only once in history, a special army commander general was appointed. This happened during the rule of Razia Sultan, the only female ruler of Delhi Sultanate. After her death, the position of army commander was removed. It never became a permanent post. 3. How were soldiers paid? Land grants, ikta. Most soldiers were paid by being given land. They did not own the land. They were allowed to collect income or tax from it. This income was used to feed themselves and their horses and take care of their families. Cash payment, sometimes. In some rare cases, soldiers were paid money, cash, but this was not very common. Who actually paid the soldiers? It is not fully clear from history books. There are two possibilities. One, the commander, like a mukti, received all the money or land and then distributed it to the soldiers. Two, the soldiers were paid one by one directly by the state. Most historians believe the first method was used. The commander got the salary and then managed his own men. 4. Strength and weakness of the army. Weakness, poor organization. The army did not have modern training. There was no scientific system, no regular drills, and no strict discipline. Soldiers were not part of organized regiments like modern armies. Weapons and armor varied greatly between soldiers. Strength, unity and faith. Even though the army was not well organized, it was still stronger than many local Indian kings' armies. Why? 1. Religious unity. All Muslim soldiers believed they were fighting for the same faith. 2. Brotherhood feeling. They felt like one large family of warriors. 3. Foreign bond. Many soldiers were not native to India, so they stuck together for support and survival in a foreign land. Example, imagine a group of foreign workers in a new country. They may not be very skilled, but they stick together and help one another. Final deep summary, 1-minute review. The Delhi Sultanate had special soldiers, those for jihad, religious wars, and volunteers who joined freely with their own arms. Jihad soldiers were Muslims, got 4/5 of the loot. Sultan got 5th. The army was led by the Sultan, and provinces were controlled by Muktish. The Diwani Aris handled army recruitment and salaries, but did not lead battles. Only once, under Razia Sultan, was an army general appointed. Soldiers were mostly paid with land, not cash. The army was poorly trained, but it was stronger than others because of religious unity, brotherhood, and group loyalty. Would you like a timeline, a comic strip, a flowchart, or a practice quiz on this topic? I can make this even easier and fun to remember. Absolutely. Here's a great, deep, and very detailed summary of the financial administration of the Delhi Sultanate in the simplest possible English, like a master teacher explaining to someone new to the topic. Financial administration of the Delhi Sultanate, deep and simple summary. What is financial administration? It means, how did the Delhi Sultan's rulers manage, collect, and spend money to run the kingdom? To run a large empire, the Sultan needed money to feed and pay the army, build forts, roads, and mosques, pay salaries to government officers, support religious scholars and schools, help the poor. So the sultans created a tax system to collect money from people. The 10 main sources of income. The 5 most important taxes came from Islamic law, Sharia. Other taxes and income sources were also used. Let's break everything down step by step. 1. Land tax from non-Muslims, mainly Hindus. What it was, Kharaj was a tax on land, paid mostly by Hindu peasants and landlords, who paid Muslims who owned or farmed land. How much? Not a fixed amount. Sometimes they used old Hindu records. Key point, this was a major source of income. Farmers had to give part of their crop or money to the Sultan. Example, if a Hindu farmer grew 100 sacks of wheat, he might have to give 20 to 50 sacks as tax. 2. Land tax Muslims. What it was, Ushur was also a land tax but paid by Muslim farmers. Special rule, Ushur was only charged if the land got water naturally from rivers or rain. How much? Fixed at 10% of the harvest. Ushur means 1/10 in Arabic. Example, if a Muslim farmer grew 100 bags of rice, he gave 10 bags as tax. Problem faced. Many Hindus converted to Islam to pay less tax. As a result, income decreased and some changes were made to tax rates later. 3. Jizya, poll tax on non-Muslims. What it was, a special tax paid only by non-Muslims, like Hindus. It was a kind of protection tax for living safely under Muslim rule. Who paid it? All adult Hindu men, not paid by women, children, hermits, beggars. Tax rates in silver coins. Rich class, 48 dirhams per person. Middle class, 24 dirhams. Poor class, 12 dirhams. Example, a poor Hindu farmer would pay 12 coins per year. A rich Hindu trader would pay 48 coins. This tax was a symbol that non-Muslims were protected subjects under Muslim rule. 4. Khams, war booty tax. What it was, when the Sultan's army won battles, they captured loot, booty, and animals, etc. This booty was shared. Division, Sultan took called khams, the remaining forthweight to the soldier. If 100 gold coins were captured, Sultan got 20 coins, soldiers shared 80 coins. This system motivated soldiers to fight well in wars.
5. Zakat.
Charity tax for Muslims. What it was, a religious tax paid only by Muslims, used only for Muslim welfare. Rate, 2.5% of income, 1/40. Example, if a Muslim had 1,000 saved, he gave 25 as zakat. Where zakat was spent, repairing mosques, paying religious scholars, ulema, helping the poor, travelers, orphans, running Islamic schools. It was meant to purify wealth and help society. Other sources of income not from Shariat. 6. Customs duty, tax on goods traded. What it was, tax on goods that came from outside the kingdom, trade goods. Rates, Muslim traders paid 2%, non-Muslim traders paid 5%. Example, a Muslim bringing goods worth 1,000 would pay 20. A non-Muslim would pay 50. This helped the Sultan earn from business activities. Duties and tolls, on transport. What it was, small taxes on people using roads, ferries, bridges, checkpoints. Example, a trader crossing a river might pay a small ferry toll. Another using a trade route would pay a road toll. This helped maintain infrastructure like roads and bridges.
8.
Income from mines and treasure troves. What it was. If someone found gold, silver, or gems underground or found a hidden treasure, it belonged to the Sultan. If iron, copper, or gold mines were discovered, they became royal property. This rule was based on Islamic law, Sharia. You could not keep hidden treasure, even if you found it on your land. 9. Heirless property. If a person died and had no family or heirs, all their property and wealth went to the state. Fines and penalties. People who broke laws sometimes had to pay fines, which added to state income. Super simple final summary table. Source of income, who paid it, amount, why it was collected. Kharaj, Hindu landowners, farmers, land tax. Ushur, Muslim farmers, 10% land tax. Jizya, Hindu adult men, 12 to 48 dirhams, protection tax, 20% to Sultan, tax on war booty. Zakat, Muslims, 2.5%, charity for Muslims. Customs duty, traders, 2 to 5%, tax on goods. Tolls, everyone's small fees for using roads, bridges, ferries. Mines, anyone who found it, 100% to Sultan, Islamic law right. Heirless property from dead people without heirs, all goes to state, royal right. Fines, lawbreakers, variable punishment plus income. Final words in super simple language. The Sultans of Delhi had a smart and rich tax system. They followed Islamic rules and also used local traditions. They taxed land, people, trade, war loot, religious duty, and even treasure buried underground. The money helped run the kingdom smoothly and keep the Sultan powerful. Would you like a chart, timeline, map, memory tricks, or even a comic story to help you understand this even better? Here is a summary of the passage you gave, explained in the easiest way so that even someone wouldn't understand it. Topic: the Sultan's income and wealth in the Delhi Sultanate. 1. Where the Sultan got his money from. The Sultan, the ruler or king of Delhi, got money from many sources. Taxes on land and people, booty, loot from wars, trade duties, mines, property without owners. But the richest and most profitable source was taken in wars from Hindu territories. This included gold, silver, money, jewels, animals, and other valuable things. A large share of this war loot or booty went straight to the Sultan. This made the Sultan very rich very quickly, especially after winning big wars. 2. How much money did the Sultan have? We don't know the exact amount of money the Sultanate earned. There were no detailed records kept or preserved, so historians can't give an exact number. But from the stories and records we do have, we know the amount of money was very large and it grew over time from one king to the next. This means each new sultan started his rule with the wealth collected by earlier rulers. The treasure kept increasing, like filling a chest with more and more gold over time. The Sultan and the state's money. There was no fixed salary called privy purse for the Sultan in those days. The entire income of the government, called the state, was, in practice, treated as the Sultan's own money. This means, even though the money belonged to the state in theory, i.e. it was for the kingdom, in real life, the Sultan could spend it however he wanted. He could use the money for, 1, state needs, like building forts, paying the army, roads, canals, etc. 2, personal needs, like his palace, food, luxuries, clothes, family, servants, etc. So the Sultan had total control over all the money. A simple everyday example. Imagine your school collects money from all students for building maintenance, buying books, paying teachers. But instead of using that money only for the school, the principal uses some of it to fix their own house, buys things for themselves. That's what the Sultan did. He wasn't just a king, he was also the controller of all the kingdom's wealth. Final full summary.
1 paragraph.
During the time of the Delhi Sultanate, the Sultan received a large income every year from taxes, war loot, trade duties, and property like mines. The most profitable income came from war booty, especially from Hindu territories, which brought in huge amounts of wealth. Although there are no exact records, the total income must have been very large and kept increasing from one ruler to the next. There was no fixed salary for the Sultan. Instead, he controlled all the money of the state. In practice, he could use the money either for the needs of the government or for his own personal lifestyle. Would you like me to create a comic strip version of this? A diagram chart? Or a quiz to test what you've learned in a fun way? Let me know.